about Phinehas is that he was zealous. And this is what God commends him for, that he is a man who is incredibly zealous. In fact, if you look in verse 11, you'll see this commendation from God. Let's start in verse 10. Numbers 25:10. And Jehovah said to Moses, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my jealousy. Now, this translation uses the word jealousy. I've put on the screen a different translation that uses the word zeal. He manifested such zeal for my sake among them. We're going to talk more about where that comes from in just a moment. But as we think about this zeal or this jealousy, and the reason I prefer the word zeal is most Americans at this point in time, jealousy is always a bad thing, right? We tend to have a very negative view of that. So when God calls himself, for example, as we studied months and months ago, that God is a jealous God, it can be translated zealous, that he is zealous for his people. And it's a good thing in that sense. So when we see the zeal of Phinehas matching the zeal of God for his people, this is something worth our emulation. So let's talk a little bit about Phinehas. This story happens at the time when the people of Israel were traveling. They had left Egypt. They were traveling to the land of promise. And they're very near the end of their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. In fact, they've begun their trip up near to the promised land. And they come to the nation of Moab. And the leader of Moab is a king named Balak. Balak sees all the Israelites coming, and he is terrified of them. And he knows what's happened to other nations that have opposed them, that they've fallen. So Balak calls for a man named Balaam to come and to curse the people of Israel. And every time that Balaam tries to curse the people of Israel, God turns it into a blessing. So of course, Balak is frustrated by this, but so is Balaam, because Balak had offered him lots of money to do this. So Balaam, and we have to infer this a little bit from other scriptures, but Balaam provides a different way for the Moabites to defeat the people of Israel. And his solution that he proposes to Balak has to do with getting them involved in idolatry, that is, worshiping Baal like their people did, and as a part of that worship, to be involved in sexual immorality. So the Moabites sent their women among the people of Israel and got them to be involved in sexual immorality and pulled them into idolatry, the worship of the false gods. It's a plan that worked. And it's a sad thing that it worked, but it did. They gave in to that temptation. Now, in Psalm 106, the passage that Julian read just a little bit earlier, it mentions what happened at that place. And the way that it describes it in Psalm 106 and verse 28 is that the Israelites yoked themselves to Baal Peor. Yoked has the idea of being joined together, to work together for something. So instead of being joined together with God, they've joined together with a false god. In Psalm 106, it says another sin that they committed at that time is that they offered sacrifices for the dead, or to the dead. So some type of an ancestor type worship thing was going on, as if the ancestors had attained some kind of deity. What is Jehovah's reaction? Predictably, Jehovah is angry that his people have done this. He's angry because he's jealous for them. He's zealous for them. He wants them to be his people and his people exclusively. The best way that we can think of that is how we think of a marriage relationship. That I want my wife to be my wife exclusively. And I'm zealous to maintain that relationship. God is that way with his people. So because of their infidelity, both sexually and with idolatry, infidelity to him, he sends a plague amongst the people. And as the plague is going through, Moses also gives a command. You can read about this in verse 25, chapter 25, verse 5. Moses gives this command. And Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor. Now this fits very well with God's law about idolatry. That if you are involved in idolatry, the punishment is death. So Moses has made that very clear that the people are to do that, to kill those. And presumably, he's hoping this will stop the plague because of what they do. So the next part of the story is that the people are gathered at the tabernacle. And they are weeping for their sins. And there's an Israelite. His name is Zimri. He brings a Moabite woman and walks right in front of Moses and Aaron and Phinehas and all the people who are weeping for the sin and for the plague and for the death that is happening. And he takes this Moabite woman into his tent. Of course, he's flaunting God's law. He's flaunting God's anger. He doesn't care about the plague that's happening. And what an incredible display. What a brash display of someone who just doesn't care when that happens. So we read in verse 7, Numbers 25, verse 7. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he arose and left the congregation, and took a spear in his hand and went after the man of Israel into the chamber and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through her belly. Thus, the plague on the people of Israel was stopped. Nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. So this tells us how effective this temptation had been. And we also have this incredible picture of Phinehas grabbing the spear. Now, Psalm 106, verse 30 has the phrase that's up on the screen. Then Phinehas stood up and intervened. And you guys know that I like to go back to the original text, and not the original text, and look up the words and see what they mean. And the word intervened, it surprised me. I found out stood up meant he stood up. But intervened is the word that is most commonly used for prayer. And I'm still not sure exactly what to make of that. But it implies that his mind at this moment was focused on doing something that was pleasing to God when he intervened. He did something for the people. There's a part of me that still looks at this story and says, that's shocking. It's shocking the kind of sin that was involved here, but it's also shocking the action that Phinehas took and what happened because of that. The key to this story we see is at the beginning of verse 10, where we see what God says to Moses. So if you'll read with me there, Numbers 25, verse 10. And Jehovah said to Moses, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, and that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace. And it shall be to him and to his descendants after him the covenant of a perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the people of Israel. This is a powerful commendation given by God. Now, if you'll recall, in Psalm 106, verse 31, the passage that Julian read earlier, it is told to us in that passage that the action that Phinehas took was counted to him as righteousness. Does that ring a bell with anyone when you read that was counted to him as righteousness? Because that's exactly what was said about Abraham's faith. When God told him that his children would be like the stars, it was counted to him as righteousness. Here, that same phrase is used by God for the faith of Phinehas, for the actions of Phinehas, that what he did was righteous at that moment. And so God promises him a covenant of peace, and that he would have a covenant of a perpetual priesthood. That through his line, there would always be these priests. So we know that God approved of what Phinehas did. Phinehas' action at this moment is not only approved by God, but clearly it's pleasing to God. And so it's important for us to learn about Phinehas' zeal, because it's a zeal that we should imitate. So I'm going to mention 4 things that I think I see out of this. The first thing about Phinehas' zeal is that it originated in God's zeal for his own people. And that's said over and over again in this passage, that his zeal matched God's zeal for his people. So that when the people were sinning, Phinehas knew it was hurting God, it was hurting God's people, and so it was necessary for him to act. And so that's another important thing. He obeyed God's authority carefully. Moses had said what was to happen to those who were involved in this false worship and in this sexual immorality. Phinehas followed after those rules. Phinehas was not acting outside of authority. He was not acting in a way that was just impetuous. He followed the authority that was clearly given. The 4th thing is, nope, this is the 3rd thing, because I can almost count. The 3rd thing is, he acted quickly when it was necessary. I think that's a key part to zeal. And really, there's 2 components to that statement, aren't there? One, it had to be necessary. It needed to be dealt with. And he acted quickly to do it. He didn't let things slide or wait for things to fall out. He saw this man walk in front of the tabernacle and all the people who were weeping and take the woman into his tent. And that needed to be dealt with, and it needed to be dealt with right then. Because that was what was an example for all the people. The last thing is, and this is obvious from Psalm 106, what he did was righteous in God's eyes. Now, the key in that statement about the lesson is righteous in God's eyes. Because too often, and this is one of the things we'll explore in our lesson next week, is that we define our own righteousness and actually oppose God sometimes. So those are the 4 things that I learned from it. Let's check if he maintained that. Go with me to the book of Joshua. We're going to be in chapter 22. In Joshua 22, we find a time when the tribes of Israel have actually conquered the land. And as you might recall, the tribes on the eastern side of the Jordan River first got their land, and then they went and helped the tribes on the west to gain their land. So at this time, they're going to be going back. They're going to be going back home. And when they do that, you can read in verse 5 that Joshua gives them a command Now that the land of promise has been taken, and they're going over to that land, and I just realized how dark that is. On my computer, it looked great. I didn't test it this morning, sorry. He gave them several commands, none of them surprising, none of them new, but all very good reminders. Be careful to observe the commandments of God. Love Jehovah your God. Walk in his ways. Keep his commandments, cling to him, serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. Nothing new there, right? Just really good reminders that the people of Israel have had to hear time and time again. So the eastern tribes, as they're getting ready to cross over back from the Jordan into their own lands, they decide that they need to build an altar. And they built this ginormous altar. And Phinehas hears of this. We can read about this in chapter 22, verse 12. It says, let's start in verse 11. And the people of Israel heard of it and said, Behold, the people of Reuben, the people of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh have built the altar at the frontier of the land of Canaan in the region about the Jordan on the side that belongs to the people of Israel. And when the people of Israel heard of it, the whole assembly of the people gathered at Shiloh to make war against them. So they thought that this was a very serious situation, that the people from the eastern side had built an altar, and they said, we have to go to war. Why is that? What is an altar used for? For worship. And so their assumption was either they were building it to worship a false god, or they were going to worship Jehovah in a place that God had not allowed. The right place of worship, as we see here, is in Shiloh, where the tabernacle was. That was the only place they were allowed to worship God with an altar and make their sacrifices and things. So the people of Israel see what the eastern tribes are doing, and they say, we've got to stop this. And so they get ready to go to war. Phinehas is the priest who gathers all the tribes together. It says with 10 chiefs. And he goes and he talks to the brethren. They are prepared for war. Read with me in verse 16. Thus says the whole congregation of Jehovah, what is this breach of faith that you have committed against the God of Israel in turning away this day from following Jehovah by building yourselves an altar this day in rebellion against Jehovah? Have we not had enough of the sin at Peor, from which even yet we have not cleansed ourselves, and for which there came a plague upon the congregation of Jehovah, that you too must turn away this day from following Jehovah? And if you two rebel against Jehovah today, then tomorrow he will be angry with the whole congregation of Israel. But now, if the land of your possession is unclean, pass over into the Lord's land, where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and take for yourselves a possession among us. Only do not rebel against Jehovah, or make us as rebels by building for yourselves an altar other than the altar of Jehovah our God. Did not Achan, the son of Zariah, break faith in the matter of devoted things, and wrath fell upon the congregation of Israel, and he did not perish alone for his iniquity. So Phinehas comes and says, look, this is a breach of faith. You are breaking faith with God's people. Building this altar is rebellion to God, and he reminds them of the sin at Peor that he was involved in stopping. He says, we still are living with the consequences of that today. He mentioned Achan. Achan was the one who stole things from the city of Jericho when it fell. And they were told to utterly devote everything to God. And so when they attacked the next city, Ai, Israel was defeated. Roundly defeated because of that. Achan's sin affected the whole congregation of Israel. And this is what Phinehas is indicating at this time also. Your sin in building this altar will not just affect you, it will affect the whole nation of Israel. I love that he offered a solution. Did you hear that in verse 19? He said, if your land on this side is unclean, then come over and join us. And understand what that means is that those huge tribes, they'd have to squeeze them into the places that had already been decided where they would live. Phinehas is saying, we'll give up land so that you have places to live. And he makes his final appeal. Don't rebel against Jehovah. And don't make us rebels against Jehovah. So the eastern tribes have an answer. And you can read this in verses 22 through 29, but I'm going to summarize it. They say, look, if we are breaching the faith, don't spare us. If we built an altar to turn away from following God, wipe us out. If we've done it to offer burnt offerings, Jehovah will take vengeance. And then they explain, verse 24, we did it from fear. That in the future, your children would claim that we're not Israelites because we're on the other side of the river. So we built the altar, not for a sacrifice, but as a witness between us. A reminder that those on the other side of the river are also Israelites. And they said, we're not rebelling and we're not turning away from God. Is their fear justified? The answer is clearly yes. If you noticed earlier in the text, when it talks about all the people of Israel on one side, the very language that's used indicates we're the right ones, they're the wrong ones. And you and I both know that this is pretty much the way we humans work. If there's any boundary or any dissension that can be made between people, we'll find ways to do it. So, they did that. Phinehas hears this response. Listen to what he says. This is in Joshua 22, beginning in verse 30. Then Phinehas the priest and the chiefs of the congregation, the heads of the families of Israel, who were with him, heard the words that the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the people of Manasseh spoke, and it was good in their eyes. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, said to the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the people of Manasseh, today we know that Jehovah is in our midst, because you have not committed this breach of faith against Jehovah. Now you have delivered the people of Israel from the hand of Jehovah. So he says, look, this is great that this isn't a sin that you've committed. God's here with us. You're not rebelling against God. You've delivered the people here. So let's look at Phinehas' zeal in this case. And the reason that I did this, I think this is incredibly important, is often when people look at Phinehas' zeal, they look at only the first incident that we read in the book of Numbers. And they don't consider what happened here. Was Phinehas still zealous for God in the same way that he had been before? So let's look at the four things that we talked about earlier. Was he zealous with God's zeal for his people? And I think, to me, the answer is clearly yes. Building the altar implied that they were doing it for false god worship or that they were going to do improper worship. So it was an act of sin, rebellion, forsaking God. And not only that, but Phinehas clearly saw that sin would affect all of the people of Israel, not just those who were involved in it. So when he looks at the things that are happening, he's looking at it, as it were, through God's eyes, that the things that have been revealed by God. And he says, that's not right. Did he obey God's authority? And did he do it carefully? And again, the answer I would say is yes. Deuteronomy, the 17th chapter, tells us very clearly that if someone is going to worship a different god because it's forbidden, then it's told to you and you hear of it, then you should inquire diligently about it. If it's true, it's an abomination, and you are to stone the one who is involved. So death was the punishment. The people of Israel are gathered together for war, because this is what God has said about idolatry. If they were involved in idolatry, it needed to happen. Did Phinehas act quickly when necessary? So the question is, was it necessary? And clearly from Phinehas' perspective, it was. They gathered the army and they confronted these other tribes. I love how he was clear about expressing his concerns. Let's understand, he didn't attack, just attack them. And see, that's so often the mistake that we make when we start talking about zeal. There's some restraint that he shows here, because he didn't just run up to those other tribes and say, well, there's the altar, we can see the altar, bam, what's in them? He did act quickly when necessary, but he goes to them and he talks to them, because that's what Deuteronomy 17 had said. It says, when you hear of it, you will inquire about it carefully. He followed God's authority, even in this thing. So he expressed the concerns that we've already talked about. He let them answer, and he listened to them carefully. And what was the result? War didn't happen. Understanding was reached. So he was prepared to fight, but he was not impetuous, just attacking them. He didn't presume that he understood everything that was going on just from the rumors that he heard. Why is that important? Because often people who think of themselves as zealous will act impetuously and presumptuously without following God's authority. So there's a danger there. Was he righteous in God's eyes? I think he was. In fact, his proclamation, I understand now Jehovah's in our midst, says yes, he was. He was prepared to deal with the sin as clearly authorized by God. He listened to be sure whether sin had actually occurred or not. He offered a reasonable solution, not just attacking them. He was not out of control in a rage against them for what they had done. He clearly followed after God's commandments. He was righteous in those things. So Phinehas is a great example of what it means to be zealous for God. This last part reminds us that we must not confuse zealousness with being out of control or acting beyond God's authority. We need to follow what he has told us carefully. Zeal obeys God. So, we have this lesson, but I can't end without one last thought. And this is going to kind of bleed over into our lesson next week. Zeal is not a license for violence. The reason that's important is many people have looked at the example of Phinehas of grabbing a spear and running it through two people, running into their tent, and said, that's what zeal is about. And even today, we have people who will advocate that that's what zealousness is. They use the example of Phinehas to say, we have permission to kill anyone who is committing sin. And of course, it's how we define the sin, and there's all kinds of presumption and things involved in it. By bringing up the example of Phinehas, I am not advocating that kind of violence in any way, shape, or form. What did Jesus tell us is the power of God unto salvation? The gospel is the power of God unto salvation. The plague that runs through our society is sin. What is the solution to that sin? It's the gospel of Jesus Christ that tells the message of him coming to this earth, teaching us about righteousness, and giving himself as an offering for sin. I'm going to suggest to you in a very specific way that if we are to be zealous against sin like Phinehas was, then that means we must be zealous to tell other people about Jesus. Because that's the only thing that's going to stop the plague of sin in our society. I'm not advocating any sort of physical violence. What I'm advocating is God gave us a solution. And if we're going to be zealous like Phinehas in dealing with sin, we better be zealous in teaching other people, letting them know where salvation lies. Our weapon is not a spear, but it is the Word of God. And we go to people with a message of hope and heaven. So, just want to be very, very clear about that. Let's be zealous with the zealousness of Phinehas. And that means we act with God's zealousness. It obeys His commands carefully. That it acts quickly when necessary. Sometimes we fail on that point, especially in dealing with sin and teaching others the gospel. And it needs to be God's righteousness that we're pursuing. That's the gospel. So, to get off that kind of sort of morbid bad point, but needed to be made, I thought, let's be zealous out there. Let's follow that example of Phinehas' zealousness and teach others the gospel. So next week, we're going to continue with these thoughts and see how Phinehas' zeal has been misused in the past and what it means for us and how we can be zealous in other ways. We want to offer an opportunity now. If you do believe that Jesus is the Christ, you have this opportunity. If you believe that you're willing to repent of your sins and confess, you can be baptized and have those sins washed away. If you have that desire, if you need our prayers or help, please come forward as we stand and sing.
Take the name of Jesus with you, child of sorrow and of woe. It will joy and comfort give.